So Mike mentioned this concept a little while ago, this idea of thinker versus doer. And I'm not going to explain it. I'm just going to let him explain.
Okay, so this is something that came up during a conversation with a friend of mine. He was expressing how he has all these ideas happening and but he was frustrated with the fact that none of it felt like it was really getting done, or he would work on one thing and get partway finished and then start thinking about something else and would start working on that, and at the end of it there's just nothing finished. And my thought was, yeah, me too. But you and I, through our conversations, have discussed these different spectrums that you can operate on. And oftentimes we'll characterize that in these two extremes, where you have the tunnel vision, hyper focused version of you, or the broadly focused, diffuse version, where you're seeing everything all at once. Or we have the self one and self two, like Tim Galloway likes to talk about in the inner game of tennis, the conscious thinking self, the inner unconscious self, and probably others that I'm not even thinking of right now. And that way of framing things, of thinking about a spectrum with these polar ends that are mutually exclusive, is probably one of the most useful things that we have discovered. Of all the ideas we've talked through, I think those have stuck with me probably the most. And so, thinking about this problem with this friend of mine and myself, moving from one thing to the other, talking, dreaming, all of that, thinking about it along this spectrum of, you can operate at one end where you are the thinker and you are doing this kind of planning and fantasizing and dreaming and all that, describing how something could work or what it would be so cool if we built this thing. And then there's the doer version of you, which is the person who actually puts their head down, gets focused on something, and works really hard, sometimes really, really hard, and gets it done. And splitting it into that kind of binary framework, or maybe not even binary, but that spectrum of thinker versus doer, gives you a way of thinking about yourself and thinking about what state you're in and trying to identify, hey, what is going wrong here in this process. Clearly, in his case, he's spending too much time as the thinker, just thinking about stuff. So today I want to talk about that. Let's frame ourselves up with that framework and discuss, what is the thinker, what is the doer, what what do you need to be doing when you are one or the other, how do you balance that, everything that entails.
So when you first mentioned this, I thought it was really cool. And then I said, hey, let's do an episode on it. And then I started thinking about it. And I realized, or I came to that same conclusion of, oh my God, I'm just the thinker. And I end up daydreaming and thinking way more about stuff than actually doing things. And it kind of scared me. And
Yeah.
then I started reading a couple things online about this, just briefly. And they were talking about, are you a thinker or a doer? Are almost like they were personality types.
Mm-hmm.
And I really didn't like that. Number one, because I was afraid, oh my God, maybe that's just my personality type. I'm just a thinker. But also because I don't think it's accurate. I mean, I think we maybe tend to do one thing or the other, but maybe we can get into that later. But I just wanted
Yeah.
to say, yes, I have found that to be the case with me, is overthinking things and
Yeah.
not actually acting on them as much.
Well, also, as part of this conversation, I want to be careful not to minimize the role of the thinker. I feel like there's a possible tendency here to go, ah, yeah, we waste all our time daydreaming. You just got to do stuff, put your head down, and probably that is a valid point. But I actually, this is going to sound really silly as we keep saying the word think. I thought a lot about being the thinker this week, and I decided that I want to define being the thinker or thinking as a very specific thing, and maybe even separate that out a little bit from other things. So far I've been mixing all this up, but we talked about fantasy. It's very fun to fantasize about things. We do that all the time, uh, especially in regard to our personal projects and our interests and things like that. It's like, oh man, I want to build this thing and it'll be so cool and everyone will love it, or this is what's wrong with the world, somebody needs to do this, or this company should stop doing that. And I would like to define that as fantasy, where you're really just dreaming about something, some future thing. It's very ill defined. There's no real concrete steps. And that's fun, but it's probably closer to entertainment than any real work. So let's just set that off to one side and say, okay, there's fantasy, there's dreaming, that's all cool. And it has a role. I'm not even minimizing that. But if you're going to think about things, let's define that as being productive, applying your brain to something in a way that actually solves problems or gets you somewhere.
I I think I already disagree on like your
Okay,
first point.
cool.
Well, first off, let's just ask the question, what is thinker? What is the thinker? And let's try to define it and argue about it or whatever.
Okay.
And there's no right answer here, I don't think. But I was writing down what I thought the thinker was. And
I told you this would get weird.
it's weird. And here's just a couple of them: planning, predicting, daydreaming. I wrote down thinking. Wow, that's so smart. Fantasizing, analyzing, and well, you said you want to separate daydreaming and fantasizing from the thinker, and I think that is a big part and a good part of the thinker, of a person. And I wouldn't discount, because a lot of your plans are put in place to make those fantasies or those daydreams become true.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're kind of at the head of the thinker.
Okay, I know what you're saying, and I do agree. I don't want to sound as if those things aren't important, because I think that they are. So maybe this is a little bit too simplistic, at least the way I've been thinking about it, of thinker and doer, and then I want to discount other things. So let's imagine this as a large spectrum. On this end, you are hyper fixated on a very pointed problem. You're trying to fix a single line of code. You're obsessing over a single brushstroke. Like that's the end of that spectrum. And then at the end of this end of the spectrum is the fantasy, the dreaming, the thinking about science fiction or the far future. Like that's the airiest, most big picture mode you can be in. And as you move rightward on that spectrum, you get into thinking in a way that is more directed at something. And here's what I'm trying to separate out here is that fantasy is very often extremely hand wavy around any kind of real problems. I mean, think about literal fantasy, fantasy books, Harry Potter. It's cool, it's fun to think about, but the actual physics of magic and magical creatures and spells, like, it's no one's trying to explain that because it can't really be explained. It's a fantasy. You're just picturing something. You aren't filling in the details. You're just accepting it. And so when you fantasize about something that you are eventually going to work on, you aren't filling in details. You aren't like having to actually deal with the realities of, hey, is this really possible? Can it be done? What is the back of the napkin physics, math in order to accomplish this type of thing? It's fantasy. So again, fantasy is like what directs us. It helps us decide what we want to pursue at all, or just what is the future that we even care about. So it's very important. But I have noticed in myself that I often fall into fantasizing about something, dreaming about it, imagining myself being a successful musician or a successful entrepreneur or a big successful YouTuber, whatever. Like I'm imagining a future. I'm not really applying my brain to it in a concrete, let's actually figure things out sort of way.
Okay, so you sort of defined on a rough scale of
Yeah.
of what includes or what is included in the thinker mind state, and then some things that are more productive than others, right?
Yeah.
Okay. What is the doer?
Okay. The doer is when you are applying yourself to something in a way where you are solving real concrete problems. And I realize there's some overlap. You could be thinking about a problem and coming up with a
Ob-
solution.
Obviously, you can't do anything without thinking. So
Yeah, but
it's not a perfect system, but
no.
I think we can all understand that.
Yeah. To me, it is looking at the to-do list and picking an item and accomplishing it and checking it off or whatever, you know.
The thinker is the one that sits down in the morning and plans out the day.
Yeah.
And then the doer is the person who is actually
Yeah.
doing it.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah. What is it that makes you a good thinker? And just for the purposes of this question, let's set aside the dreaming and fantasy, unless you really do want to talk about that. But for me, how can you be effective as a thinker? Like if you're trying to think through a problem, you're trying to come up with a plan for something you want to execute later, how are you good at that? And I have my own thoughts there, but you go first.
Okay. The way I see it is a thinker, a good one. Once those higher fantasies and daydreams have sort of solidified, you know what you want, whatever.
Yeah.
Past that, you're thinking in direct terms of, I want to do this today, or I want to do this by the end of the week, or this is what I'm doing next month or this year. In ways that are very direct and actionable. So you're thinking in terms, concrete terms that you understand and you can set in motion or actually act on. And that is not an easy thing to do all the time. But I think that's the good way of thinking, is to be very realistic. Just to begin weeding out all of those fantastic thoughts, and not think about things you can't actually do, or hold yourself to standards you can't actually live up to. So thinking it in more immediate terms and actionable terms.
So a couple weeks ago, my wife and I were watching Twin Peaks, and we were watching it. So Agent Cooper, the FBI agent investigating Laura Palmer's murder, there's all these scenes of him talking into his voice recorder. He gets into his cabin at night or his hotel room and he's, note to self, I need to look into this and that. And he dictates everything into this voice recorder. And I made this comment to Sam, like, I really wish I had one of those. That's so cool. I want to take little memos into a voice recorder. Just an offhand comment. Well, a week or so later, it's my birthday. For my birthday, she bought me this little voice recorder that looks just like what Agent Cooper has. So I laughed. I was like, oh, that's great. You know, that's a great gift for someone. I would never buy one, but it's funny and, cool. So I started just kind of goofing around with it. I would take it with me and make little notes to myself as I'm walking around. And it turns out I absolutely love it. And I kind of think that everyone should have one.
Okay, I'll buy one.
Yeah, I really do recommend it. And you could argue, hey, you could just make voice notes into your phone. And sure, you can. But the voice recorder is set up. I love this. No one in the world is going to care about this but me. But I love this. You can take out the voice recorder and it has a switch on the side, like a toggle switch, which is already amazing because the switch tells you the state that it's in. whereas a button does not. You just have to push a button and know whether it's on or off or something. But it has a switch. You push the switch up and it is recording. And then you pull the switch down and it stops recording. So at any moment, the only action you have to take is to pull it out of your pocket and push the switch up, and then you can just start talking. And when you're done, you pull the switch down. It's gorgeous. It's beautiful. The entire world of software and phones and computers cannot even hope to approach just the beautiful elegance of a goddamn switch that just works when it's on. It's I love it. I just love it. So I start goofing around with this thing. At first, I'm like, oh, okay, first time talking into my voice recorder, haha. But I ended up falling in love with it because it helps me think. And using it a lot, I started to reflect on why does this help me think? So I walk a lot, don't have a car. So if I want to go anywhere, I'm walking. And I just like to do it anyway. But what will happen on a walk, I will think. Sometimes I will even sort of mumble to myself like a crazy person as I walk around. And it doesn't seem like putting a microphone in your face would make any difference at all. You know, if I'm muttering under my breath, thinking through something, and then I stick a microphone there, what's the difference? Well, it turns out the presence of that microphone causes you to have to operate in a different way. It's a lot like journaling, where when you're having to write something out on a piece of paper, it becomes linear and you have to follow through with the beginning of a thought or an idea. And the microphone in your face kind of does the same thing. So I would notice that without the mic, if I'm just walking around freely, I will very often get stuck on these sort of thought loops where I'll have an idea and I'll just sort of replay it over and over in my head. Or for example, this would happen a lot in the past, as I was working on a YouTube video, I'd be thinking through a sort of script or something I wanted to say, and I would get to one part and I would say it or think it, and then again and again and again, trying to get it perfect, not liking the way it sounded, or I don't know. But my mind would just kind of sit there and cycle on something. The other problem I would notice is that often I would begin a thought, and then before really working through whatever the implications were, my mind would just kind of jump to something else. If I'm working on this YouTube video, I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to explain something about the relationship between this chord and that chord. And before I really get to any concrete details of exactly what I'm going to say, my mind just kind of jumps to something else and goes, okay, and then we'll talk about this. And I'm just sort of hand waving away the actual details. But with that mic in my face, if you start saying something, it feels very odd to just trail off and jump to something else. It kind of forces you to stay linear, to actually power through this difficult part in the thinking process and get to the end, and then transition and go to something else. So I have listened back to a few of these, mostly not, and that's not really the point. The point is that putting this thing in my face has helped me to think better. And I don't think having a voice recorder is the only way to do it, but it was a really powerful way of making me think better. And I actually really do recommend it as something that everyone should at least try. It feels like journaling, except it's not slow. I mean, it takes a long time to write stuff out. It's like journaling, but at the speed of speech.
I still do the same thing. I've been using voice memos for the last couple of years, and I'll get in the car, and if there's something that I need to think about, I'll just turn the recorder on and describe the problem. And then when I run into some big mess in a painting, or I can't figure out what to do, I'll sit down, turn the recorder on, and describe the problem. And almost every time it helps me get through it. And for whatever reason, it just kind of focuses your mind on this one problem, and you have to work through it in a way that doesn't happen in your weird thought world where it's just anything's possible.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah,
I
it's
agree.
very similar to the rubber duck programming. Have you ever heard of that? It's this
You
kind
know,
of,
I've never heard of that. Yeah.
okay, some people have. It's this technique in programming where you have a rubber duck on your desk, and if you're stuck on a problem, you explain it to the duck, and often enough, through the process of having to put it into concrete terms and think through the explanation, figuring out what the priors are, how to set that up, then you wind up just figuring out the problem. It puts your thoughts into a way that actually has to make sense. So anyway, that to me is very helpful with the thinker, or trying to be effective at thinking. Really, the fundamental problems there are that it's it's what I just said. Like, it's easy to wind up looping around on something. It's easy to wind up abandoning a thought before you've really resolved it. And often that's kind of doubly bad because you haven't thought through a, a a problem, but because of the sort of weirdness of the way your mind works, it's almost like not only have you not solved it, but it kind of creates this feeling as if you had, like, oh, I thought about that, but you didn't really. You kind of dodged the hard part. And so now there's this problem that's kind of lurking that feels resolved but isn't. It's almost worse than having not thought about it at all. I would encounter this a lot with the YouTube stuff, like getting into an explanation, realizing, oh, I thought that I knew what I was going to say, but I don't. Actually, the hard part has not been figured out.
So you're saying to be a good thinker, you need a good tape recorder.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying.
You're saying to be a good thinker, you need to be able to think in that way all the time. Um,
Yeah, I mean, this might be a bit of a what not to do rather than what to do type of thought process on my end. So the problems that I noticed are the looping, the jumping from one thought to the other, and then uh, fantasizing rather than actually thinking, which we said there's a role for fantasy, but it's not really something you want to do when you're really applying your mind to a problem. Dreaming about how great it's going to be once you've solved it is not the same thing as actually trying to solve it. Oh, one more thing on the thinker. I think it's the role of the thinker to set things up for the doer. And this is pretty similar to the self one and self two that Tim Galway describes. The conscious thinking self makes decisions on what are we going to practice today, where are we going to go to do it, do we even want to play tennis today or not, what coach do I hire, that kind of stuff. And same thing here, the thinker you is the one building the to-do list. It's the one deciding whether I wake up on time this morning and go somewhere, or I lay in bed and scroll around on TikTok. The thinker creates the environment for the doer. And oftentimes you will have problems as the doer, but it's not really that you're bad at doing, it's that you made bad choices and are in a bad environment. Trying to work on a very challenging problem while you have a friend over and the TV is on and you're sitting in the living room drinking a whiskey, like, that's a very bad environment for that. And so of course you can't do it, but that's not a doer problem, that's a thinker problem. What are you drinking? Is it wine?
port wine. Yeah,
Yeah, do you like port?
I guess. I don't know the difference, but
I don't
it's good.
either. I've always heard people share very strong opinions on port, like, oh, it's amazing, or oh, it's disgusting. I don't know
Just
if I've
tastes
ever
like
had it.
wine.
Yeah. Well,
I have
huh.
no idea what the difference is, but yeah, it's good. It
If you
just
blind
tastes.
tested me with wine, I couldn't pick out a single one.
If you blind tested me with port and wine, I don't know if I could tell the difference.
Okay.
It might taste a little darker, or I want to say that it tastes less sweet, but I'm pretty sure people talk about how port is sweeter. So I don't know.
Okay.
Whatever. It's
Well,
pretty good.
we're in agreement on that.
Okay, one thing I've noticed with me is that I will think about what I want to do. I want to create all this art, and I want to be this type of artist, and I want to do all these things with art. And you think about it a lot, and you think about the details of it. You think about your process, how you're going to do it, when you're going to do it. all the things that matter, and you really got it figured out, and you just keep thinking about it. And then it comes time to do it, and it doesn't seem attractive. You think about actually sitting down for 3 hours and just painting. You're not living the dream. You're just
Yeah.
you're just painting for 3 hours. You're not solving these giant problems that you've thought about. You're not scheming or doing anything super exciting. You're just painting for 3 hours. And so when you build up all of the thinking beforehand, the actual act of doing it sometimes doesn't seem all that exciting. And there's also all kinds of problems that you didn't think about because you didn't want to think about them. Like, I don't know, the adhesion of the paint isn't working, or you don't have the right paints, or you don't know how to solve this problem or whatever. So you weren't thinking about that. But when you have to do it, you then have to deal with these frustrating things and the stuff that you didn't really think about. So I've just noticed this overthinking, over dreaming, or fantasizing, building this way up, and then you turn and you look at the thing you're supposed to be doing, and you think, I don't really feel like doing that right now. And it's pathetic, but it happens a lot.
Yeah.
And I think it's mixing in too much fantasy, but it also, in doing that, when I do that, at least, it's like I'm leaving out, when I think about this stuff, I leave out the joy of painting. I'm not really thinking about the actual joy of painting, and I start to forget it. And I'm thinking about all this other stuff, and that becomes the prize. Now, if I'm a little bit better and I actually start doing the thing, I slowly start to realize that, oh yeah, this is why I want to think about all that stuff in the first place. Painting's actually really fun, and I don't care that much about all this big scheming and trying to figure out how to do this all the time. I just kind of enjoy the painting, and it's weird. It's like a different category. But sometimes if you spend too much time as the thinker or the fantasizer or the dreamer or whatever, you start to forget, or your priorities end up drifting towards that. And then the actual act of doing the thing doesn't really seem like it relates at all. And they just become separated.
Yeah. I feel like there might be a few things going on there, but part of it, and we've beat this drum quite a bit, but I think part of it is when you are on the far end of the thinker, when you are the fantasizer and the dreamer, and you're picturing wonderful things that you're going to do one day and everyone's going to love you for it. That is a very, I'm sorry for this word, it's a very arousing state of mind. And
you use that a lot, but
it's the right, it is the correct term. I'm sorry, it's not my fault. This is what is used in scientific literature. Your state of arousal. It just is.
We're not that scientific, but
well, but there's, what else do you call it? If you want to give me a euphemism for arousal, go ahead.
I don't know, exciting.
Fine.
It's an No, let's go with arousal. Go ahead.
You get very excited when you're dreaming and thinking. That changes as you move along that spectrum, where when you are really focused on a problem, it's quiet, you're not distracted, you're by yourself, just working away at something difficult that no one can help you with. You're just working. And sometimes that needs to go on for hours, and it's boring. It's the far opposite end of that. So you are very not excited. And I think that is an uncomfortable state of mind if you've been spending a lot of your time being excited. And you get excited by a lot of, the dreamy fantasizing state causes that, but also just entertainment and spending time on the internet and everything. Like we've constructed this multi-trillion dollar network machine alternate reality in order to excite people. So it's very difficult to bring your mind all the way down into this far lower energy state of just doing something really boring for hours and hours. And so I think that part of the resistance there is due to that, where it's fun and easy to be dreaming. Thinking is somewhat harder, but it's still relatively high level. But doing, that's hard. And it's a much, much lower state of arousal. I mean, excitement.
Well, yes, especially at the beginning. But, well, I'm talking about painting or playing music or something.
Yeah.
And when I'm thinking about sitting down and painting, you're right. It seems, I don't feel like sitting still and just painting for a while. That sounds really hard, actually. And I don't really know what I'm doing. That some of it's confusing and frustrating or whatever. So that seems really difficult.
Yeah.
But a lot of times when I get into it, I'm very excited and I just want to keep painting. And then you end up sort of hyper focusing on it and you just kind of become obsessed with it. And then, oh, I don't need to sleep tonight. I don't need to eat. I don't need to do anything. I'm just going to paint for 8 hours,
Yeah.
And then you get really into it. But it's weird because it's like the shift from fantasizing into actually doing it is difficult. But then also if you just stick with it and do it, sometimes it's much more exciting than the fantasizing. So
I
don't know.
Yeah, couple thoughts. I agree with you. I think that kind of gets into the focus train, right? It's hard to push at first, but then once you're moving, you focus better. So I think you do become comfortable with it and your mind starts to become invested in the thing that you're doing after a while, usually. So, after 10 or 15 minutes, you're usually fine. Like you can sit there and focus on it and you can even become hyper focused. But I think it's always a harder transition going that direction than the other way. So if you are not able to focus on something, you're just distracted, wasting time, scrolling TikTok, it's pretty hard to get yourself to get focused on something. If you are focused on something, it's not hard to become distracted and get back into that higher excitement state. So it is just a fundamentally harder direction to go. And I think that just has to do with the way our brains are wired. And we're built for an environment that is very boring with isolated moments of absolute terror and life-threatening excitement. And so our minds are geared to very quickly reorient themselves to that exciting thing and be aware of any interesting thing happening around us. And that's fine when there aren't very many interesting things happening around us. But nowadays there are, and our minds are just not really wired for that. Very similar to how in an environment of abundant food, it's pretty easy to overeat now because our minds and bodies are kind of built for an environment where food is not abundant.
Okay, one thing I've noticed is that it's much. If you're at the beginning of something, let's say you want to be a musician, you want to be a rock star, you want to compose music, whatever, and you haven't really written that much music, but this is the thing you want to do.
Yeah.
And you think about it, you think, oh, I want to be this type of musician. I want to write these types of songs. And you're always listening to music and you're always dreaming about this thing. And maybe you've, written a few sketches of songs or whatever, but you keep thinking about this and you really think hard because you want to make sure you're doing it the right way. And you want to make sure you know all your theory and you want to make sure you just know everything about everything. But you just keep thinking about this. And then you sit down to write a song and all of a sudden it's the most difficult thing ever. Or you write it and you think it's good. And then the next day you wake up and think, oh God, this doesn't line up with me being an awesome musician. This sucks. It's not good enough. And it's very difficult. Or you write a song and then it just sort of it doesn't fit what you were dreaming about or what you were planning with or whatever. And it's not like what you were thinking about before was so bad. I mean, you really thought through this stuff.
Yeah.
But you write one song and it doesn't line up. It doesn't fit the mold you were constructing. And it becomes very difficult to continue writing. And I've noticed that if you have very little material, then thinking about that bigger picture stuff or scheming about how you're going to, accomplish your dreams or whatever, it's very difficult. But if you have focused more on the production side and you've made, 200 songs and you've never really thought about what type of musician you want to be, you've just made 200 songs.
Yeah.
Well, then you can spend one day standing back, listening to your music, and then you just know, oh yeah, I'm that type of musician, or this is what I gravitate to. Like, you have so much more data to choose from, and you know yourself, you know your music. It doesn't take long at all to figure out the bigger picture stuff. You select 20 of those songs, you say, oh, cool, these 20 are good enough. Let's make an album with those and let's ship it off to these people or whatever, and let's show this person and get signed over here. I don't even know if people still get signed. Or let's get released on this platform or whatever. Like, you have material to work with. And I'm finding that to be the same case with art and with my own music. I don't want to talk about music, but the more stuff you have, the more that bigger picture stuff just kind of defines itself. And it turns out that all of your previous predictions and dreams or whatever, you can almost just throw them away, because what you've produced is the defining factor in the rest of it. So if you're going to lean one direction, lean towards the doer, and then think about the big picture stuff after you've done a lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think this is also why children tend to be really good at learning, because they don't spend a whole lot of time thinking. They just do stuff because what they do doesn't have to fit this giant picture of their life. It doesn't have to make sense right now. It's just the thing they want to do, so they do it. And they end up with a lot of material in whatever they do. And then when they graduate high school and they're forced to confront what they're going to do with the rest of their lives, then they start looking back and trying to figure things out or whatever.
Right.
But if you have a lot of material, there's a lot of options of things you can do with it. If you don't have a lot of material and all you do is think about what you're going to do once you do have material, it's very difficult. So I am trying very hard to lean into the doing side and not think so much about the big picture, which I have spent so long doing. It's almost working. It is working against me in that every decision I make, I'm like, wait, does this line up with the bigger picture? Does this whatever? And then it ruins whatever I'm working on because I'm thinking about all this stuff that doesn't really matter. So I'm trying very hard to focus on just doing. If you're doing a piece, just focus on that one piece. You'll figure out how it fits together later. You'll figure out how this fits your master plan of your life. Actually, you probably never will. You definitely never will. But finish the piece, focus on that, and then when you've done 20 of them, step back. Then do the thinking and the fantasizing. You'll have something to work with.
Yeah, I like how you're giving this advice as if you're talking to anyone but yourself.
I'm talking to me.
Clearly, this is you in this hypothetical. Yeah, actually, I think that's an excellent point. And that kind of goes back to the process over product type of philosophy. But, part of thinking is planning and deciding how you're going to structure things for yourself and where you're going to put your time and what you're going to delegate and all that sort of thing. And focusing that on creating a very effective doer that's in a really excellent environment consistently and isn't getting burnt out and distracted, so on. Like, that's a very valuable use of your planning and thinking time. Whereas if you are instead doing a lot of fantasy or thinking about identity and what you're going to become and what people are going to think, that is probably not very productive. And even though there is a role for dreaming and trying to decide what it is you want to go after, really putting your energy into the actual day-to-day, I think, is really where it's effective.
You know how they say that the parent's responsibility is to raise the kid to no longer need them. I
Yeah.
mean, that is their sole responsibility. You want the kid to be, or as they grow up, to be completely independent. They don't need the parents anymore. I kind of think it's the role of the thinker to raise the doer.
Sorry, my dog is
Like,
I have censored him.
okay, I kind of think it's the role of the thinker to create an environment and train and become the doer who kind of no longer needs the thinker, at least for the most part. Obviously, you don't
Yeah.
want to lose the ability to think, but you want to create an environment where you can just go, where you just make music, or you just paint stuff, or you just program, or whatever. You don't want to be thinking about the big picture stuff, and you don't want to be thinking about your environment. You don't want to be thinking about all that bigger picture stuff. You want to be thinking about the thing. And so I think it's the role of the thinker to make space for the doer to just do stuff. All right, so what's the big takeaway of thinking of thinker versus doer, or categorizing what you do as thinker versus doer? How have you seen this be useful to you?
I find it useful to, maybe it even makes more sense to call this three things, like the fantasizer, the dreamer, the thinker, and the doer. I'm just going to call it that for now. Like trying to
Okay, I
separate
like
out
that.
some of the dreaming and fantasizing into one thing, recognize how fun that is, and how it's pretty easy to just wind up doing that with no real productivity coming out of it, right? So there's that. There's the thinker, which is you thinking through issues and making plans, solving problems, and the particular issues that I run into there, like trying to remove these issues, is getting stuck on a single thought, abandoning thoughts and ideas before you've really finished thinking them through, or doing a lot of fantasizing when you're really supposed to be thinking about a real problem. And then part of that role is really setting things up for the doer, making sure you're in the right environment and so on. And then as the doer, what's important there, I mean, largely, I think you make the big choices as the thinker. When you're trying to be the doer, you're just doing, you're just working, and ideally you're distraction free. Ideally, you're able to get focused. Ideally, you're able to recognize when you're getting too focused and you actually need to kind of take a break, maybe even spend a little bit of time as the thinker again, make sure you're on the right path. But
Or
largely,
not
that's just,
thinking.
sure. Well, separating them,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
It's easy to wind up spending, let's say you get too focused and you wind up spending 3 hours working on something that's useless. I've done that countless times, solving a problem and then realizing, oh, you know what, I wasn't even going to use this anyway. I was going to rewrite this next week no matter what. Like, this is useless. Like, it's so easy to get stuck hyper fixated on something and not even realize that it doesn't really matter. So set yourself up in a good environment, and being focused and effective is something that just develops over time. If you're coming from a hyper excited environment where you're not doing any real work or focusing, and then you immediately jump into that, it's quite a shock and you may not be very good at it for a while. But like getting adapted to that, doing it consistently, I think you settle into a good groove. And then, like I said, recognize when you're over focused, take breaks, relax, spend a little bit of time as the thinker, make sure you're on the right track, that sort of thing.
Well, my takeaway is basically to just do. I don't have to tell myself to think about all this stuff. I do all the time.
That's probably fair.
Or I do think all the time. I need to just do. So I'm really trying to just, every time I catch myself thinking or daydreaming, it's, does this actually apply to something you're doing right away? And I'm finding when you do stuff, or when you're actually doing stuff, like I'm in the middle of a painting right now, and when I'm not quote unquote doing, I'm thinking about doing, but I'm thinking in actual concrete terms, and I'm thinking
Yeah.
about how do I solve this next problem, And that's what I'm thinking about, which is very useful. So I'm finding, and hopefully I can keep it this way, but when you keep doing, your thinking is much more realistic and much
Mm,
more specific. And you're thinking it in real terms that actually make sense. So you're kind of switching back and forth from doing, thinking about doing, and then doing and thinking about doing, and it all kind of flows together. And that's where I want to stay,
yeah.
is in all my thoughts actually make sense. They may be wrong or right or whatever, but they make sense and they apply to what I'm actually doing right now. As soon as I stop doing something, my thinking just kind of goes all over the place into something I want to do 10 years from now, or whatever. It goes into fantasy land. And if I'm in the middle of a project where I'm actually doing something, my thoughts kind of stay grounded. And I really like that. And it's also really exciting, and I want to just keep working. And
Yeah.
that's to me the best place for me to be, is in that state.
Actually, I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think that's a great point. Too much time as the thinker or even the dreamer, you kind of lose your grounding. If you spend a lot of time doing that, grounds your thinking to where you're having to actually think about real problems, realistic things. Otherwise, you just kind of float off into space.
Yes. God. Can you save this?
Yeah. I mean, there's got to be something in here, right? Might cut out a lot of the beginning. I think the beginning was bad.
That is totally fine with me. Okay, well, let's wrap this up. Any last words on
No,
this topic?
I'm going to be gone for a couple weeks, so no podcast for a while. And then we didn't have a podcast for a few weeks because we are both, I don't know.
Thinkers.
Yeah, we spent too much time thinking and not doing. But send us some topic suggestions. We need some things on the to-do list. So let us know. But we'll see you in a few weeks.